Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today we are going to continue explaining the principles of Romanticism. The last point that we discussed, it was their belief in the supernatural strangeness. Our class for today will be split half. It will be two parts. The first part, I'm going to continue explaining the beliefs of the Romantics. Then we will have a presentation about Arab Romanticism, right, in the same field. So I'm going to do my part first, then our sister is going to make her presentation later. The first idea that I would like to explain today is the concept of the Romantic poet. How did they define, right, the Romantic poet? Is he supposed to be a man of super abilities, different from common men, right? Actually, he is not. Actually, he is not. Right. What do you think?
That he's a common man who talks to a common man. He has deep feelings and he expresses his feelings about it.
Good. Right. So he is defined as a man who talks to men, but of a greater sensibility. That he is more sensitive than the common people, right? And because of this greater sensibility, it makes him feel more than others, sees more than others, and expresses himself deeply. When we talk about the word sees here, right, it is not necessarily related to vision, right? But yeah, but he is thinking deeply about things, right, because of this greater sensibility, and he will be able to express himself deeply, right? Too many people, they have feelings. They are, right, sensitive people, but they don't have the ability to express themselves, right, deeply or properly, and this is what makes them different from the poets. The poet, right, is, this feeling is not exclusive to poets. Many people, they can have this deep feeling and this greater sensibility, right? But the problem with these people that they cannot express themselves deeply. So we have two conditions, right? The first one, greater sensibility and the ability to express, right, himself or herself deeply. This is what makes a romantic poet. So we find that in their definition, they are not making the poet of super qualities, but a common man, a man who talks to men, a man who talks to men. He is not distinguished. He is not from the upper class. He is not from the elite. He's not supposed to be noble. No, not at all. Just a common man. Just a common man or a common woman. Their belief in the romantic nature, right? And we talked about this, but, right, as I told you before, there is a famous statement about romantics, right, that nature was not everything to romantics, but they would be nothing without it. They would be nothing without it. And why? Because nature, it became iconic to them. What do I mean by iconic? That whenever we mention Romanticism, the first thing that comes to mind is nature, right? Yeah.
It's the moving force of their emotions.
Good. Yeah. I mean, before we go ahead, right, to explain their belief in the romantic nature, I would like to explain that it became an icon for Romanticism. The word what?
Nature.
The word nature, it became what? Icon for Romanticism. But does that mean that Romanticism only believe in nature? No. They have their own set of principles, but the most famous one is their belief in nature. Right. So to them, right, nature is the first source of inspiration. Right? And this is why we said, right, they believed in the subjectivity of nature. What do I mean by subjectivity of nature? That they never cared about outside manifestations, the outside appearances of nature. but what they cared about, it was really how they felt, right, during, right, or towards nature, while they are in nature, right? So they think that nature is dynamic. Why? Because it moves them. It moves them. Moving, and not in a sense of a motor moving, no, but moving their own feelings. All right? It gives them inspiration. It gives them inspiration to write. So it is the moving force behind what? Behind writing poetry in Romanticism. And I am saying this again, that it was not everything to them, because they believed in the supernatural, believed in imagination, believed in the common man and the common place. They had a lot of what? Of beliefs. But one of the most important, right, it was nature. It was not everything to them, but they would be nothing without it. Why? Because it is the icon that, right, identifies their own existence. Well, also we explained this, that nature was subjective to them. What do we mean by nature was subjective to them? It means that romantics use the objects of nature for what? To reflect upon their own feelings over these objects. But the objects themselves are not that important. What is important is what they feel when they are inspired by these objects. Well, they did not also use the background, right? The nature as a background, a beautiful background, as I told you, right? When you have a natural scene as your desktop wallpaper, right? And I asked you why did you choose, right, this natural scene as a wallpaper for your laptop or your cell phone? And if you say because it is beautiful, means that you are using it as a beautiful background. They never used nature as a beautiful background, right? But it is something basic to them. What do I mean by something basic? It makes them feel. It makes them feel. It makes them, yeah, it is. Actually, it is, right? So they are not interested only in the outside appearances, but they are interested more in what? In their own deep feelings, right? While in nature. Well, their belief in the romantic imagination. How do we define the romantic imagination? What does it mean, right? What is your understanding of the word imagination? If I ask you now, right, define the word imagination, what comes to your mind? Yes, please. Something not existing. Yeah, yeah.
To go beyond our five senses.
Right, going beyond the five senses. Good. Something else. Yes, please.
It's a work of the mind, but it actually has to do with the five senses. It moves the five senses.
It moves the five senses, but it is the work of the mind.
Work of
Right, yeah, I understand. Yeah, but I mean, is it only the work of the mind?
No.
This is the question. Yeah.
It contains the feelings and the work of mind. And it's
Correct.
something that the writers strive from it to reflect the truth in the life. But what is happening in the life, in true life, they are trying to convey it as from the imagination by using feelings and mind.
Right. Just imagine. Look at this. All right, just imagine that we live without imagination. Right? How life would be.
Like a soul.
Right? Monodimensional. Do you know what I mean of monodimensional? Means only one dimension. What makes our world sometimes better is our own imagination. Sometimes we say that the feelings that we have are only the products of our own imagination, right? The love that we feel, the hatred, sympathy, are all the products of our own imagination. Some of the products of our own imagination. It is a superpower that makes us human beings. This is what makes us different from. Thank you.
Or anything.
Right? Yeah. Imagination. It's our own existence. If you don't have imagination, it means that you don't have brains. This is what American says. You don't have brains. When they say don't have brains, doesn't mean that you don't have this little organ in your skull. No. It means that you don't have imagination. Can you imagine that we don't have imagination? Kanan. Huh?
Because we are imagining.
Yeah, you see? That you need the action of imagination in order to imagine that we don't have imagination. Well, fine. And this how it was to the Romantics. It was fundamental to poetry. And poetry without imagination is history. Do you remember when we discussed, right, recollection of ideas in tranquility? When we said, if you go ahead and write your poetry or straightforward without waiting till you calm down, it means it will be the product of what? Of history. You are historizing. You are writing down your poetic experience. But you should calm down till you come into a state of a pensive mode. Then you use your imagination to recollect. Recollect how you felt at the time of the poetic experience. Right? And therefore, without it, we don't have poetry. What do we have? According to the Romantics,
History.
we have history. We have history. There's the difference between history and poetry. Right? And I don't know whether you still recall when I asked you what is the difference between history and literature, and we defined history as what?
I mean, poetry is a selective representation.
Yeah, when we said that both of them, they have the same definition. We define history as a record of the human experience through time. And we define literature as well by what? A record of the human experience through time. So sometimes we might not have a big difference between history and poetry, right? The difference that one is selective and one is collective. Now we can add another difference. One has imagination and the other, it doesn't have imagination. Right? Did you get the point?
Yes.
Well, fine. Okay. And it is part of their belief in the individuality, that every human being has his own imagination, which makes him different from the human being. What makes us different? It is not our physique, because we have all the same systems, the same organs. What makes us different is our imagination. This is what makes Ahmad, Mahmoud, Khalila, Hiba, Suad. This is what makes them different. It is not their own names. It is their own imagination. Well, fine. And, right, unlike fancy, right, some people, they would define imagination as a kind of fancy. And fancy, right, before the Romantics, it was the synonym of the same word imagination. When people asked, right, what's the meaning of imagination, they would say it's fancy. The first one who made distinction between fancy and imagination, it was Samuel Coleridge. It was, thank you, Samuel Coleridge, right? Who said that there is a big difference between imagination and fancy. Yes?
Yeah, fancy does not really convey the truth.
Good.
But imagination does.
All right. So imagination conveys the truth, but fancy takes you away from the truth. This is what makes difference between what? Between imagination and right, fancy, because imagination conveys the truth while fancy does not. By imagination, right, they believed that they could see what ordinary eye cannot see. I want you to remember that we can add this to the definition of the Romantic poet. When we said that he is a man of a greater sensibility that makes him feel more than others, sees more than others. Right? How does he see by more than others? By his own imagination. By his own imagination. And we will witness that this is going to be part of their own right, poetry. Whenever we read from their own poems, we will discover, right, that the poet himself expresses himself as someone who is able to see more than others by the means of his own imagination. This what makes people creative, their own imagination. Those who have limited imagination are not creative. They cannot see well. But those who have, right, great imagination, right, a fruitful imagination, they are much more creative than us. Right. Imagination works on the senses and gives them visionary insights. And now I am reminding you of whom this is their own belief against the theory of John Locke. When John Locke believed that the five senses, right, they are, right, as I told you, they are the input devices to whom? To the mind. And the mind is passive. The mind is passive. Without the five senses, it is, right, not having a function. It's not having a function. Now they believe the opposite, right? That imagination, right, actually works on the five senses. It's superior to the five senses. We can see while we are closing our eyes. We can, right, hear while we are sleeping. While we are sleeping, right? The meaning is given to what is received by the five senses by imagination. And what if we don't have imagination? The five senses are useless. They are only like the input devices, but we don't have a processor. We don't have a processor, which is the imagination. Which is the imagination. Right? So, to make it short, they believe imagination is superior to what? Superior to the five senses. And meaning is given, right, to what is perceived by the five senses by the means of imagination. Samuel Coleridge divided, right, or the first one who is actually divided imagination into many types, right? Yeah, but before he divide, right, he gave a kind of a definition for the imagination. Right? This definition is, it is the union of deep feelings and the profound thought. Right? This is the definition of, right. Let me, explain a little bit, right, on this definition, right, to see, to come out to an important conclusion. What is that? Right? It is the union of deep feelings, this is one, right? And a profound thought, right? This is number 2. Right. I want you now to recall the definition of poetry according to William Wordsworth. What is the definition of poetry according to William Wordsworth? It is what? It is spontaneous. Right. Spontaneous overflow of powerful. Hold on. Feelings. Right. Recollected in tranquility. This is the definition of what? Of poetry. Right? According to William W. Right? This is William Wordsworth. Right? And this is the definition of what? Of imagination. Here. Right? We said it is the combination of two things: deep feelings and profound thought. Deep here, it means, right, overflow and powerful. Overflow and powerful. It means deep, both. Feelings means feelings. It is still the same, right? And the profound thought, which is, right, when you are in a state, you have a pensive mood and you are thinking deeply. And this doesn't happen unless you are. So in tranquility means the profound thought. What is the conclusion? That the conclusion is that the definition of imagination is exactly the definition of poetry. In other words, poetry is good. This is the conclusion. Poetry, right, equals imagination. If there is no imagination, good. This is the conclusion. No imagination, no poetry. No poetry at all. Right. تفضل يا أستاذ. Yeah. لا لسه إيش مالك؟ Do you have any question that you would like to ask? نعم. لا, before, right, it seems that you were smiling. I thought that يعني, you have something to say. Right? Is that okay? Well, so then he divided, right, imagination into two types: the primary imagination and the secondary imagination. What is the primary imagination and what is the secondary imagination? Lama.
Well, the primary imagination happens when you're asleep and not conscious, and the weak.
We can have a primary imagination while we are awake.
Yeah, I think we took an introduction to this, that what happens when you're dreaming and what happens when you're awake.
All right, there will always be time to reconsider, right, what you took previously, right? It doesn't mean that it is wrong. A primary imagination is the imagination related to the poetic experience. Write it down in Romanticism. Primary imagination is the imagination directly related to the poetic experience. What do we mean by that? We mean if the poetic experience is imagined and it is not real. The Romantics believed that the poetic experience is not necessarily to be true. It is not necessarily to be true, but it can be imagined. It can be imagined, right? For example, right, when a poet writes about a love poem, it is not necessarily that he is in love, right? But it is the product of a primary imagination. But when he says, for example, every time I remember my beloved girl, it makes me happy. Right? هو أصلا أنت حبيت عشان تصير سعيد. Do you understand what I mean? زي اللي كذب الكذبة وإيش؟ So this is a secondary imagination. Do you understand what I mean? A secondary imagination which is actually produced as a consequence for what? A consequence for the primary imagination. Again, I repeat that again. The primary imagination is the imagination directly related to the poetic experience. When the poetic experience is imagined, and because they believe, Romantics believe, that it is not necessary for the poetic experience to be true or real, but it can be completely imagined. So if someone writes a love poem, it is not necessarily that he is in love, but maybe he has not seen anything in his life before, right? Okay, then the secondary imagination is something dependent to the primary imagination, a consequence, something related to the primary imagination. So when the one who wrote this love poem, at the end of the poem he says, every time I remember my beloved, it makes me happy. This is a secondary imagination. لأنك من الأساس ما كنتش يعني in love. Do you understand what I mean? This is a secondary imagination related to the primary, a consequence, a result of the primary imagination. Right? Yes.
So, an African-American writer quotes that Amanda Zaki said once that she was, like, when she first tried to write a short story, I guess, she thought about things like about her childhood, terrible things, but she said there was nothing. My childhood was absolutely perfect. But I was told that you had, like, the creative writers usually have difficult childhood or bad ones. So she said, I tried to make up terrible things
Yeah.
with my parents.
Yeah, this is a primary imagination, right? And then when she says, this is still affects me till today, this is what? This is a secondary imagination. Because already her past was almost perfect. Do you understand what I mean? زي ما احنا بنقول بالعربي بيكذب الكذبة وصدقها. لما يكذب الكذبة ايش هذه؟ هذه primary imagination. ولما يصدقها هذه secondary imagination. مش تكتبوا ليها في الامتحان بكره كذا بالكذبه. Right? Well, fine. So each one might have a primary imagination, and we might have also secondary imagination, right? Well, but both of them, right, are right sometimes related completely to each other. I will give you example from William Wordsworth in a famous poem. It is called The Daffodils. It is called The Daffodils for William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth, right? Some people they say that the poem was originally written by his sister Dorothy, right? And he did not witness the experience at all. But the one who saw the daffodils while she was having a walk over the mountains, it was his own sister Dorothy. Some other people they say no, that it was both of them. Right? I'm going to assume the first, not the second one. That the one who saw a group of daffodils while she's walking, it was his sister Dorothy, and she wrote about it, and he read, right, the writings of Dorothy. Then he imagined that the one who walked on the mountains, had a walk on the mountain, it was himself, right? And he wrote a poem as if he is the one who witnessed what? The daffodils, which are beautiful flowers. And at the end of the poem, he says, every time I remember these daffodils, they bring happiness to me. They bring... يا عم انت ما شفتهم مش من الاول يعني انت بدك تخرط علينا. Right? This is the first one. He imagined a primary imagination that the experience is his own experience, not his own sister's experience. Right? And at the end of the poem, that it fills his heart with pleasure every time he remembers the daffodils. You need to see them in order to remember them. Do you understand what I mean? But you already, all right, first of all, you did not see them. How can you remember them? Yeah. Well, but by the force of imagination, you can do everything, right? It is, you can see by your eyes. This is why we say imagination works on the 5 senses. You can see by your imagination. You can hear by your imagination. You can smell by your imagination, right? And this is how, right, things work. Well, fine. This is what we are going to work on next time. What you are going required to be doing. ما بتحتاج وقت كتير؟ يعني منيح؟ تمام. المفروض إلا 10 تكون مخلصة عشان بدي أروح على المبنى الثاني. إلا 10 تكون مخلصة. تمام. I want you to check the solitary reaper, this one, right? And you print out the text. You print out the text. This is going to be our first application on the theory of Romanticism. We finished the principles of Romanticism, and we will start the application. Our first application on Romanticism will be the solitary reaper, right? What are you required to? You need to check, right, the internet and make a printout for the text. You bring the text along with you next time, inshallah. All right?